I'm Michael Mammay, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Blind, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
I'm Michael Mammay.
He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl? Well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together, and this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Michael Mammay on the show with me. Michael is a brand new voice in military science fiction. He has an exceptional new book that just launched a couple of days ago. When you're hearing this, it's called Planetside, and it is a remarkable, amazing book. It's put out by our friends at Harper Voyager, and I think you guys are really going to love it. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Thank you. I begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
It goes back quite a ways for me. I was probably 18 or 19. I was in college at the time, and that's about 30 years ago. It's a while back. And I had some electives. I was at West Point. Wrote a couple pieces for the school magazine, really kind of humorous essays. But I used all my electives on literature courses, even though I was an economics major. I used my electives on literature courses, and I told my mom right then. I was probably 19 when I told her I wanted to be an author, and it took me a long, long time to start actually working toward that goal. But if you look at the dedication of my book, it's to my mom, and it says to my mom, who was the first one to believe. Because when I told her, and when I was 19 years old, that I wanted to do it, she believed me. So it was kind of cool.
Michael, I hear those stories over and over and over again of that person that is an encourager in a writer's life, and sometimes it's as simple as, a teacher that grades an essay or something and tells, the young person, wow, you really have a gift. You should stick with this. And you would not believe, well, you probably would believe the amount of people that have just held on to that all through their lives, that one piece of encouragement. And then to have a parent who recognizes the gift and keeps encouraging a kid, that is a really, really special gift.
Yeah, I think so. And, so I retired from the Army a year ago, and I took a job teaching English.
Nice.
And it's something that I kind of want to pass on, I teach high school English, and, I hope that I can instill, if not a love of writing, then at least a love of reading in some of the students. That's something, that's a reason why I really, really enjoy the job.
I love it. My oldest son he got his bachelor's degree this year and is working on his master's now. But he starts teaching English in just a couple weeks when school starts back. Is his first job, and because we instilled such a love of reading and writing at such a young age with him, that was the only thing he wanted to do. He wants to write and do other things as well, but career wise, he said he couldn't see himself doing anything but teaching English. So that's a pretty good gig.
Yeah, last year was my first year. I really loved it. I go back here. Actually, the day after, I go back. I'm already back. I forgot what day it is. The school starts on Monday.
Yeah, we're time traveling. That's the beauty of podcast is we get to be time travelers.
Yeah, school starts Monday.
Oh man, the summers are too short these days.
They really are.
Yeah. So Michael, what kind of stuff did you love to read when you were a kid?
Oh, I started out early on. Thing that the series that really got me interested in reading, from a little library in Exeter, New Hampshire, was The Wizard of Oz. And there was believe it or not, there's a whole series of Wizard of Oz books. And I think I read every one of them. And I don't remember any of them because I was probably 7 or 8. And then I kind of gravitated toward Hardy Boys mysteries, and also I liked sports books when I was a kid. And then I was probably 13 or 14 when I started moving into fantasy. A lot of fantasy. Piers Anthony, those kind of books way back then. And then the one that really got me early on was David Eddings. With the Malorian and the Belgariad, and those just giant series. I mean, now we don't think anything of a 5-book series of books. I mean, it happens all the time. But back then, to me at least, in my little kind of small corner of the world, that didn't happen, And then to read those 5 books together and into a series, and I really started my love of fantasy and science fiction as well. And then probably a little bit later, I picked up Elizabeth Moon's stuff. And I think that's probably what really made me want to write fantasy, which I did. I wrote fantasy before I wrote science fiction. My first book that I wrote was a fantasy. It's gone, and scholars maintain that it never happened, and it will never be seen. But that was really my first love, and I really kind of transitioned over to science fiction from there. But I still read both pretty heavily.
I love that. So many folks go on to write other genres, but fantasy is something that people talk, lovingly about. The remembering back to that first discovery of fantasy stories, and I think it doesn't matter what you go on to write. That foundation of those imagined worlds and world building and all of that stuff. I think those are great skills that we pick up from writing fantasy and reading fantasy.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's some amazing writers who do wonderful world building and fantasy stuff I couldn't even really aspire to. I mean, if you read like N.K. Jemisin and what she does with world building, look, it's fantasy, but it applies to whatever you're writing. I mean, if you're writing science fiction, you can apply what she does in her world building to science fiction just as well. And in fact, I'm writing kind of an epic sci-fi that I just started writing. It's nowhere near finished or even sold yet, but it's more epic, and it really draws a lot more from fantasy because it's so big in scope. Which you get these fantasy novels that are huge in scope. Planetide's a pretty small book. I mean, it's a single point of view, first-person narrator. So it's a pretty small book, and I'm writing something a lot bigger, but it really draws on my fantasy reading almost more than my sci-fi stuff.
And for a lot of times there's a fine line between science fiction and fantasy. When you start getting well beyond our solar system and you start alien creatures and different worlds that the rules of physics are different, that starts sounding a lot like fantasy in a lot of cases.
Oh, I think so. I mean, you could argue really, really strongly that Star Wars is fantasy.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. I think space fantasy is probably a better descriptor, surely better than than just science fiction. I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely got its science fiction parts. I mean, you get the space battles, and you get the the X-wings going against the TIE fighters and stuff like that. But you also have guys who basically do magic.
Exactly. And you've got the hero's journey and all that good stuff.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But Planetside is military science fiction, and there is a rabid reader base out right now that just loves military science fiction, can't get enough of it. With your history of things that you like to read and kind of the foundations of that, and then with your military service, was it a kind of a no-brainer to go into military sci-fi?
I think I was always going to write stories with soldiers in them. Whether it was going to be military sci-fi, I think so. I mean, that's a long. I'm kind of stumbling over my answer here, but yeah. But I think it probably was. It wasn't really what I set out to do, but I had the idea in my head, kind of, for this story. And I really just had a couple kernels of it. And the thing that really inspired me was actually not a science fiction book in this case, but I read Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. And if you read it, the first chapter, it's got this voice, right? It's got this first person voice that just punches you in the throat, and it just grabs you. And that's when I knew. That's when I'm like, oh, that's this story. I need that voice, and it's not that voice, but it's a similar style of voice to that. Where you can kind of hear the character, and he's got a very distinctive personality and voice. So yeah, and it really tied together. I mean, I've been reading military science fiction forever. The Forever War and Scalzi's Old Man's War, and Heinlein's old stuff. Some of that stuff is kind of not aged well, but it's still there.
Yeah.
It's still there, and it's still the foundation for a lot of what we do.
I'm a tried and true Heinlein fan. From one of my very first experience of science fiction was a Heinlein book, and some of the stuff doesn't age very well, but there's always a special place in my heart for some of those earlier books.
Yeah, to me, probably my favorite military science fiction book of all time that got utterly ruined by the movie was, and you already know what I'm going to say.
Oh, yeah.
Starship Troopers.
Oh, yeah.
But as a book, it was so brilliant in what it did. As a military history buff, the war that he described is really, really like what, if you follow historical trends and how you get from one battle to the next, and how we move from World War I technology to World War II to modern day, it's a natural progression. It's just so perfect for what it could be, and I think that gets lost in some of the other stuff. But it was a really good book.
I'm so glad that you referenced Gone Girl, because what makes that book and so many books like them great are their character descriptions, the way that the author just draws the character, and they become very real to you. And I think that's why we get so invested in those books. And in reading Planetside, which I've been doing, you have a really great way of world building, if you will, but character building, especially. And that's why I love authors that read outside their genre and reference things outside of that, because we can all learn from authors that do different things from us and allow us to bring those different accents from different genres into what we do. And I think it makes us better writers and helps us to be better storytellers.
Oh, I definitely agree with that. Planetside, it's military science fiction, but it's also mystery.
Right.
There's a pretty solid mystery bound up in this. It's not necessarily a whodunit, but a kind of a what did they do it, kind of what did they do, kind of thing. And it's almost got its roots in, something like almost like a Nelson DeMille kind of thing, where like the General's Daughter or something like that.
Right.
So it's definitely military, and it's set in a military, in a battle zone, in a war zone, and he's working around military characters. But it's also got a little bit of a hint of kind of like a noir mystery to it, I think, and actually, more of a thriller. So it is military science fiction, for sure. But it's got some branches that kind of reach over into some other genres too, I think.
Sure. You spent a good bit of time in the U.S. military, served in several conflicts. What was your and went to West Point that you mentioned earlier? What was your initial draw to the military? What drew you in there?
It's going to be horrible. It's not a sexy story. So I was standing in my guidance counselor's office when I was a junior in high school, and I had just done really, really well on the SAT, and I didn't have money to go to college for the most part. And my guidance counselor said to me, "Hey, if you got into one of these military academies, you could go to college for free." I'm like, "Oh, awesome. Where do I sign up?" And so I did. I signed up and I went to the senator's office, and I had to interview with the senator and all that stuff. And that's how I kind of ended up at West Point. And I absolutely went into it for the college. I went in there believing I would do 5 years service afterwards, which is what's required to pay back your commitment. And 27 years later, I finished my career. It wasn't something that I set out to do. It was a means to an end for me. It was an education. But once I got in there, I loved it. And, I couldn't see myself doing anything else.
Well, I used to work for Congressman Sonny Montgomery, who authored the Montgomery GI Bill. And, that bill put a lot of servicemen and women through college. And a lot of people did their military service and then, were allowed to were enabled to get an education. And I think that's a fantastic reason.
Yeah. Well, whether it's good or not, I guess people can judge for themselves. That's the honest truth. That's why I did it. But I ended up loving it. I didn't love West Point so much. It was hard. But I love the military. I love the Army and being in the Army. And most of all, I loved and love soldiers. And I love working with them because they're amazing. I think we kind of fetishize soldiers a little bit in our country right now. And we think of them kind of as heroes. And some of them are and some of them aren't. But they're all people, and they're just people who are together trying to do stuff, and they're just no BS guys for the most part, and girls and women, and I just love being around them, and that's probably what I miss about it the most. That's probably the only thing I miss about it.
As someone who writes military science fiction, and you mentioned earlier that you knew when you were writing that there were going to be stories about soldiers in one way or another. At what point did this book, Planetside, start coming together for you? And in writing it, do you recognize any elements that maybe you took from your military service that show up in the book?
Yeah, my last combat tour was in Afghanistan, and I was at Kandahar Air Base there. And so some of the setting for Planetside kind of came from there because I saw some unique things with the setting and how the commands were structured. And it worked, it worked for us over there. But I kind of looked at it and I'm like, man, it's a good thing that everyone here is a professional, because if they weren't, this would be really, really, difficult. So, with Planetside, I took all the difficult parts and I ramped them up to about 11. and created a pretty dysfunctional environment. But it's absolutely based on Kandahar. The Kappa base is based on Kandahar. The people, none of the people are real. They're amalgamations. They're General Sarada. He's 15 different people in one. But the thing that I really, really tried to capture from my service was the relationships between the soldiers. Relationships, even in the military, aren't black and white. And I think you see that sometimes in like bad movies where, the sergeant's just yelling at everybody, and he's kind of a one-dimensional guy. And the officer says something right, and he's very disciplined and he's very strict, and everyone does exactly what he says right when he says it. Individuals in service, and each of them have their own opinions on things. They have their own relationships. They deal well with some people. They don't deal well with others. They follow orders fast. Some people, they're going to kind of try and do their own thing and get around things. And I tried to capture some of those relationships and how seniors work with juniors and stuff like that. So, if you're halfway into Planetside now, you probably noticed that, it's not a super rigid structure. There are people of the same rank who argue with each other, and they want to do different things, and they both have different ideas about what's right. And maybe one of them's right, and maybe one of them's wrong, but maybe they're both wrong. And I won't tell you which that is until you get a little further.
That's fantastic. Michael, you mentioned that you wrote a fantasy book before this book, and that book that shall not be named. What made you shift gears to military sci-fi out of fantasy?
It was a story that was just speaking to me. It was just screaming at me that it had to be written. I'd finished the fantasy, and I kind of set it aside, and it needed more revision, and I just didn't want to work on it anymore. And I had this idea that was kind of just germinating in my head, and it was really not the whole story, but it was Carl Butler, the main character, and it was that first chapter, and him being sent to do something in a distant part of the galaxy that he really didn't want to do, and I just had that idea in my head, and it was just kind of speaking to me, and I wrote it in like 8 weeks. It came really fast, and now I rewrote it many times after that. But the first draft I wrote in about 8 weeks because it was just yelling at me to be written.
That's amazing. So you wrote it in about 8 weeks, then you start revising it. What did you do with it? I know you're with Harper Voyager now. What was that journey like from having that finished manuscript that just poured out of you to now having this fantastic paperback that's out for sale now?
Okay, well, I finished writing it I finished the first draft, I think, in February of 2015. I work with a lot of beta readers and critique partners, and I sent it out to all of them in different rounds, and I probably did 3 or 4 revisions. And then I entered a contest that I'm associated with now. It's called Pitch Wars, and it's where you submit your novel to a group of established authors, and each one of them picks somebody to work on as a mentor. And it's really, really competitive. About 3 or 4% of the people get in. I'm a mentor for it now. It's actually just now going on. It's at pitchwars.org if you ever want to check it out. But anyway, I got into that contest, and another Harper Voyager author named Dan Cobalt picked my novel, and then he worked with me to revise it one more time. And then I started querying it in about November of 2015, and I signed with Lisa Rogers, my agent, in March of 16. And then we revised it again after that a couple times and sent it out on submission, and Harper Voyager made an offer.
Nice. What has surprised you, Michael, about the process that maybe you couldn't see before embarking on this? As a published author, as someone who's been all the way through the process now, is there anything that jumps out at you that you're like, wow, I never would have imagined this would have been this way?
I think the easy answer to that is the pace and how slow it is. I talked to my editor for the first time in December of 16. And they offered on the book that day in the middle, just before Christmas of 2016. And my book is coming out on July 31st, or it came out on July 31st of 2018. So it's just a really, really slow. And that's okay, because then what I also didn't realize was really how much goes into it. Yeah. How many different edits you're going to go through, and all that stuff that goes into it. So there's a lot that goes into it that I probably didn't know about. And I'm really just now starting to figure it out.
As you look back from where you are now, Michael, do you look back and see younger you, and could you ever have imagined when you were a young man thinking about these kind of stories that this would be your fate now?
Yeah, I think so. I think I could. I could imagine it, but I never put any energy to it.
Right.
I always had ideas for books in my head, and they were always things, that I thought about. Oh, this would be a good story, and a lot of that actually went into that first fantasy. But then I really didn't start seriously figuring it. That there's this idea that everyone has a story in their head, right? And I believe that. I just don't believe everyone can get it down on paper. And there's a really, really big learning process from, hey, I've got this great idea for a story, to I can put that story on paper in a way that people are going to appreciate.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think people are natural born storytellers, and there's a certain gift that allows people to make things up. But from there to writer is a lot of times a journey. It's just because you have the storytelling gift doesn't mean that you can take a story from beginning to end, write it, revise it, make it presentable, and find an audience. That they are not necessarily the same thing.
Oh, definitely not. I studied. When I started writing, I got out books. I got out books on how to write, and I studied, and I kind of learned how to do it. And I created that first book, and I sent it off to a couple people. I sent parts of it off to a couple people, and I realized I had a lot still to learn. I really, really didn't understand story structure, which people have different opinions on that, but learning about story structure and teaching myself about story structure has absolutely helped me turn the corner as a writer and get to a place where I can get that story out in a way that hopefully people are going to want to read it.
You talked about how Planetside just really poured out of you over an 8-week period. Did you plan the book out before that, or were you just kind of pantsing through that 8 weeks and the story just unfolded in front of you? I guess what I'm asking is, was there any pre-writing that went into it, and did you have a plan?
I had no plan. When I read Gone Girl, and I wasn't even through it. I was just a few chapters into it, and that's when I knew that was the voice. I sat down and I wrote a chapter, like that night, and I sent it off to about 3 readers, and I kind of knew it was good. But these were all people who had read my other stuff, and it came back. I got notes back from them immediately. One of them specifically said, "Hey, no offense, but this is really good. It sounds like a completely different author wrote it. It reads like somebody else wrote it," which I didn't take offense, because it was very, very different from what I had done before. So I had that voice, and I just started writing. I had no plan. I had a first chapter. And I kind of had an idea for the start of a plot, but I had no idea really beyond about chapter 2 what happened. And I started writing, and a lot of that's gone now. A lot of it was experimental draft. I was kind of telling myself the story. But so much of it developed as I went. I kind of put characters into scenes together, and things happened that I did not expect. So in chapter 7, which you probably passed, Butler goes in there and he talks to the medical colonel Elliot for the first time. And in my head, when I started writing that scene, he was going to go in there and she was going to have a piece of information he needed, and he was going to kind of run over her and get that information. Well, I put them in the scene together, and Elliot just started talking, and and it became very clear. Like, she was like, "No, that's not going to happen," And then as a character, she just pushed back on his character, and a character she becomes a huge part of the story. It just came to me as I was going, and the final twist, which you probably haven't learned yet, I didn't even know that. I woke up with it at 4:30 on New Year's Day. So I started writing in late November, and 4:30 on New Year's Day, I woke up in the morning and I just had the idea, and I got up and I wrote it down right then. From like 4:30 to 5:30, I just wrote the idea down, and that really became the main twist.
I think a great lesson out of that, Michael, that I'm gleaning from that is sometimes finding that true character's voice or that true tone of the book that just really unlocks something in you is more important than all of your witty outlining and all of the twists and turns that you try to think ahead of. Finding the voice of that book, and when it resonates so deeply, sometimes just trusting your subconscious self to get the story out is more important.
I think for me that's true. It's not for everybody. I have friends who diligently plot out everything, and it works for them. I don't think there's a right or a wrong way to write a novel. I think there's a right way for me. And for me, I got to get that voice, and I kind of got to go. Now, I am being driven to plot more. Because another thing that I didn't know about being an author is what happens with your next books, right?
They want to know what it's going to be about.
Well, so book 2 is done. Book 2 is a sequel to Planetside, and it's already turned in. I mean, it's not done, but it's done. It's done for now. It's a full book. It's went into my editor. And I'll get edits back on that any day now, and I'll be working on that. But I'm also working on book 3 because that's how publishing works, right? You're working 2 books ahead. And what I have to do for that, in order to sell it, because I have a 2-book deal, in order to sell a 3rd book, I have to turn in an outline and the sample chapters. So I have to write the outline. So it's been really, really hard. But my agent is really good at it, and she's kind of been coaching me through it. I actually have 2 books that I'm pitching, and I've written outlines on both of them, and she's giving me feedback, and they're okay. The outlines are okay. Now, I know I'm going to start writing this thing, and it's going to change because that's how I write. But it's pretty close. I think I know the beginning, middle, and end of it anyway.
And those are really the important things. If you, I usually when I start a story, I'll have a beginning, and it's usually something that happens that kind of sets things in motion. And then a lot of times I'll know where it's going to end, and maybe some big emotional point. And then it's just writing toward that. And then what happens in the middle is anybody's guess. But I think that's a pretty great way to do it.
Yeah, and something I kind of learned from my study of story structure, or what I took out of it, is I kind of write to points now. So I'm definitely not writing toward the end when I'm writing, but I kind of write toward quarters, right? So the first quarter of the story, you're going to have kind of a first act. You're going to have a first act conclusion, if you will, climax, some point of rising action where something happens, and I kind of write the first quarter of the book toward that, and then I'm going to have a midpoint, and I want something to change, like a fundamental thing to change in the way that we view the story at the midpoint. So I write that, and that's the second quarter, and I'm really writing toward that. And for me, those little bites, which are pretty big, I mean, if you talk about a story that's, between 80,000 and 100,000 words, which is kind of where my books fall, you're talking 20 to 25,000 words for a quarter, but it's easier than writing 100.
Yeah.
So I kind of try to write to those points, and I feel like writing to those points really creates something that is going to happen right there at a quarter or at a middle or three quarters, and it keeps you from bogging down. You hear about the soggy middle of a book or something like that, and I think if you have a key point to write to in the middle there, it can help you avoid that.
Absolutely. I know a lot of writers that have that same kind of goal in mind with the points that they're writing to. My friend Chuck Manley, who's a science fiction and fantasy author, calls himself a pantser with a plan. That he's got a few points he's going to hit, and then pantses his way to hit those points. And I've always liked that idea.
I think that's a great term. I might steal that because I think that's what it is for me. I mean, my scenes never end the way I expect that they're gonna. The characters get in there and they do what they're gonna do. But I do get them into that scene. Like, I know I'm gonna get them into that scene. But what happens when they get there? Sometimes they have a different idea, and I think that's okay. I think that makes a character more. I think that makes your dialogue a little bit more realistic. If you go in there with the dialogue already in your head, like, I'm going to force this line, then I think it can come out a little stilted. Now, there are people who do that and they do it really well. So again, your mileage may vary. I'm not here again to preach any kind of solution. There's not one answer to writing.
Yeah. Well, after doing more than 430 of these author interviews, I've learned that there are more than 430 different ways to write a book, and everybody's experience is different. But the great thing is that when we talk to each other, there's always at least one nugget that somebody says, "Wow, that's a great idea. I'm going to incorporate that into my writing." And we all do it differently, but I think we can all learn from each other too.
Oh, I think so. And I think you got to put yourself into situations where you do learn from other authors. And whether it's coming to a podcast like this, if that's your way of ingesting it, that's great. For me, I do a contest where I mentor other authors, and I have a lot of critique partners. I'm also in a group for debut authors. 2018 debut authors. There's probably 200 of us in a group on Facebook, and we just share information about stuff. Because it's not just the writing, right? It's, hey, what do you do when you get your first bad review? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with this? My publisher is not giving me any support, which is not true. My publisher is giving me wonderful support, but there are people who don't get that. So, yeah, I think wherever you find your writing tribe, you got to find it.
Right. That's right. And lean on them, because there will be days where that are really high and days that are soul crushing. But that what makes us different is you get up the next day and you write anyway, and that's what makes a writer.
Yeah, I think so. Or you don't. I probably went 2 months straight without writing a new word. I just didn't. And there are people who would tell you that that's horrible and you got to write every day. Well, you do unless you don't. Some people do need to write it. I've never written every day, ever. Because when I was writing Planetside, I was writing 5 days a week because I was in a weird situation. I was living away from my wife because I was on my last duty station. I was getting ready to retire. And I was up in South Carolina, and my wife was down in Georgia because my son was in school, and we didn't want to pull him out. He was in a really good situation, and we didn't want to pull him out. So 5 days a week, I was living in an apartment by myself. So I had plenty of time to write, and I wrote every night 5 days a week. And then I came home for 2 days on the weekend, and I didn't even think about writing, because that was time for my family, and it wasn't much. So I was trying to give that time to them. But I knew I could go back and write, the other 5 days. So, So that's kind of how I went about it.
Well, and a writer that that doesn't spend time with other people, and especially people that he or she loves, if you don't fill that tank up when you come back to write, you're not going to have anything left to give. You have to find a way to balance that output with intake, and it goes back to like you were talking about in fellowship with other authors and just keeping up the camaraderie. That goes a long, long way to helping you to stay creative.
Oh, I agree. And I think also, there's that, wow, is this just me? This is really hard. Is this just me? And here's the answer. Universally, no, it's not just you. We all go through it. If you're a writer, we all go through it. We all have been rejected and then felt crappy afterwards. We've all felt envy at something else. We've all looked at something else and thought, I can write better than that. Why is that there and my thing not? I mean, we've all had those thoughts. Everyone has them, and you're not alone. And if you talk to people who have the same experiences, you'll find that out, and it won't make you feel better. It'll make you feel a little better, that at least it's not just you, And if you're struggling and you need some time to fill up, then you got to do it, or and that's okay. I think there's this idea, especially with authors who are trying to break in, that, hey, I want this to be my job. I need to do it every day. Well, you may be, but maybe not. You have to do what gets it done for you. And if that's every day, if you're one of those people who have to write every day, then you, by all means, I'm not here to tell you not to. But I'm also here to tell you you don't have to.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and we all love those stories of when writers are sharing those stories in the trenches. I send out 50 queries, and I was rejected 50 times. But that 51st one, that's when someone realized, and I found the right agent or the right publisher, and we have to share those stories with each other. The good, the bad, and help encourage each other.
Oh yeah, I have that story.
Yeah.
So I came out of Pitch Wars, which is a pretty high visibility thing, and I had friends in that group that were signed with agents within a week. Right. I had friends who had book deals within 2 weeks of that contest ending. And for me, military science fiction, look, there's not a lot of agents out there who really want military science fiction. There are a few, and they really want it. The ones who want it really want it. But there are a whole bunch who don't. And so I queried 32 times, and that was really about the extent of the agents that I found that I thought were a fit for my book. And I got rejected 27 of those. And so I started querying at the beginning of November of 2015, and at the end of January, I had no books out, 0. I had no full requests out, no partials out. I'd had one partial, and it had been turned down. It was a very nice note. Hey, you're a really good writer, but I don't think this really works for me. I think the tropes are too familiar. So I had no hope, really. And then starting about the first week of February, everything blew up. And, an agent wanted it, then another agent wanted it, and another agent was seriously considering it. And, so I went from having no hope on the 10th of February to signing with my agent on the 1st of March.
That's
yeah. It happens fast when it happens, right?
Right.
It was the same thing with publishers. No love, got rejected. Open an email one day. Hey, David wants to talk. I'm like, that's very good. I'd like to talk to him too.
Let's talk, David. And on the other side of that, we've come with this fantastic book, Planetside, which is available now. Everyone, go grab your copy of Planetside. Michael, it's been a great joy to talk with you. If people are just discovering you now, where can they find you online? I know you have a fantastic blog that you keep up, and you post all kinds of content on there. Where can they find you? I am
so I'm pretty easy to find. It's my first name and my last name, Michael Mammay. Michael is the traditional spelling, Mammay, all one word, and .com is my website. You put an @ in front of it, that's my Twitter, and you search for it on Facebook and you'll get my author page.
Excellent. Michael, we're going to send everybody to see you, and there's a link to everything in the show notes. Everyone go get your copy of Planetside. Michael, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hedwig slipped into David's den, the circular reading room. A ladder of crude rungs protruded from the wall, remnant of its days as a grain silo. He pulled himself upward, rung by rung, until the bookcases and sofas were far below. Even if he fell and died, he didn't really care anymore. No, he did care. He couldn't die yet. She had to die first. That would make their divorce final, if she wanted it so much. Darkness enveloped him. He reached the top of the ladder and stepped off onto a catwalk of black mesh, lit only by the faint light of the 4 square windows that encircled the turret. From this perch he could see the exit she would use. He felt like an assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald in the window of the Texas schoolbook depository. But he wouldn't use a rifle, no. Rifles leave evidence. Rifles can be produced in court. Rifles can miss. He pulled back a shroud of burlap and opened the cardboard box he'd stashed up here earlier that day. He reached into it and withdrew the only murder weapon, the only magic bullet a Van Brunt could ever need. The gold lantern flashed in the moonlight. He held it up to the window. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, he thought. And then it's time for a midnight ride. But it won't be Paul Revere. No, not Paul Revere at all. He found the oyster knife at last. He lay his cupped palm sideways over the vent. Don't get blood on your Armani. And stabbed the blade into his palm. The blood came hot. He dripped it into the lantern, where the skull of the horseman waited to sip it like nectar. The reliquary glowed, and an incantation in Old Dutch appeared, shining from within the metal. It was time. Hedwig bent and whispered into the vents. Rise, headless, and ride. The letters vanished, and a cold white light burst from the thing. The skull wasn't just a skull anymore. It had gestated. Capillaries clung to it the way fine hair clings to the crown of a newborn. A thick, carotid artery moved with snake-like undulation, drinking blood from the pool at the base, pulling it upwards to circulate through scarlet vessels, through twisting coils, slurping the liquid greedily, the way little Zeph used to slurp strawberry Nesquik through a crazy straw. The blood pulsed and pushed into the nose, into the eyes, into the hollow cavity within the skull. But was it hollow still? Hedwig didn't think so. He felt a mind growing there, something with a will to challenge his own. He fixed his gaze to the twin caverns of its eye sockets, speaking slowly and deliberately. Jessica Bridge. The death's head grin broadened somehow, and a thread of black and green liquid, shiny as a horsefly's wings, trickled from the gap of a missing eye tooth. Only Jessica Bridge. Do you understand? He shook the lantern. Do you understand? The face lurched forward and struck the glass, leaving a red splash there. It wobbled and settled, smiling and nodding. Jessica Bridge, hissed the face. Yes. Hedwig raised the lantern a little. Jessica Bridge. The red face tipped backwards and the jaw cracked wide. Hedwig recoiled. Something pink and wet writhed inside that mouth. The nub of a new tongue, salivating as if it could taste the name. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge.
Jessica Bridge.